hear the question? Okay. What I would say there is that you potentially have an internal control issue that, you know, the CTE person didn't know about the equipment being sort of repurposed, or, right, that there's some sort of miscommunication, right? You should, or whoever was repurposing it didn't check to make sure first that there was a CTE use. Because if there is a CTE use, it is that priority, and the priority level is written out in the regs. So if you know, if it didn't exist at the time and you repurposed the computers because nobody said they claimed a use, and then only like the next year a new person came in and they decided, you know, at some point you've written off these computers. They're no longer CTE computers. You went through the priority, right? You've disposed of them. They're off your inventory. Like, at some point you just have to kind of cut it off. It's not that they necessarily have to have a string on them to CTE programs for all eternity, right?
That's always the question, because there isn't an inventory tag necessarily. Now the control will be Excel spreadsheets.
Right.
So then as soon as it gets to a point, it's like, okay, we're going to stop tracking it.
And then once the value goes, yeah, you absolutely get to a point where you can stop tracking. And it's when it's no longer needed for the use, right? So it start there, and then once it's that, then you just have to update your inventory log or your tracking log. Does that make sense?
We're trying to think of the ways that somebody could possibly circumvent.
Well, think about those and then come back to me. Come back to me, okay? Well, you think some more, okay?
I would be asking some of the same questions, but I need to rephrase it to try to be clear. So under the current United States Department of Education's definition of interference, it includes shortening the life of, not useful life necessarily, but life of a piece of equipment, regardless of what the amortization period might be. And that stops only when the piece of equipment is either not needed for program needs, or it has reached obsolescence and doesn't function.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Anybody else? Yeah.
So that means the scramble for every computer in the building right now that was going on the parts testing online. And I have heard Chromebooks being there. They go by
No, and that's because it's a single one-time off-use for a test, for a makeup test, right? When they talk about interference, they want to, they say the rule of thumb, any like regular repeated use defined usually as more than 5% of the time of the equipment. I've seen it go up to even 10% in some programs, and it's program office by program office. It's going to depend on who you get as to how they want to define it. But yeah, a one-off use, absolutely. If it's not being used, you need the equipment for, you know, a single day because you got a field trip coming in or a makeup test, or, you know, that's fine.
A related question: when you use shortening the life of a piece of equipment as an example of the United States Department of Education's definition of interference, was that just to illustrate their interpretation, or are there other aspects of how they construe interference?
That's really to illustrate the interpretation. So his question is, and when I said shortening the lifespan of the equipment, and that's just because that's the language I've seen from the U.S. Department of Ed in monitoring reports, and this is not regulation, this is an interpretation of a regulation, right? And it's coming from various program offices, so it's not uniform across programs, it's not, right? It's just that when they've issued findings where they've said, look, you purchased this equipment with this federal grant, and, you know, and then the grantee comes back and says, well, wait a second, it's not interfering, and they point to that, the department comes back and says, no, it does interfere, it's regular use. It's shortening, it has an effect of shortening the lifespan, and that's why you have to allocate out those costs. You cannot simply, you know, use that dedicated Perkins equipment for those other costs. Yeah, no problem. Questions? Everyone? The other thing I want to make sure that I highlight for you guys is this trade-in, replacement equipment. You know, there's a set of disposition rules when it comes to equipment, when you dispose of them, of your equipment. If it's above a certain $5,000 threshold price, you have a payback to the federal government for their fair share. Is that familiar for people, folks, maybe? Well, there is a disposition rule that if it's a fair market value, $5,000 or greater, there's a payback. This rule says, you know what, even if it's over $5,000, if you're using it as a trade-in for replacement, you don't have to worry about paying back and then paying out the money. You can just simply use it to offset the cost of your replacement equipment, right? You can do a trade-in with the truck or with your welding machine or whatever it is, and just use that to lower the cost, the purchase price. I mentioned the supplies and the definition of computing devices. So we'll move on to procurement. Procurement, so who are my post-secondary folks? We got some post-secondary folks, right? We got spread out. Here. Procurement rules in the new EDGAR were drawn from the rules that applied previously to state and local governments. So for the most part, state and local governments are going to be very familiar and recognize the procurement requirements. Our post-secondary folks, though, these rules are going to look a lot different, and they're going to be a lot more prescriptive than what you are used to. Because of that, the U.S. Department of Education has offered a 1-year grace period for post-secondary institutions to come into compliance with the new procurement requirements that come out July 1, 2015. So if you want to, you can take advantage of that 1-year grace period. You would have to notify the state to let them know which set of rules you're following with regard to procurement, and then for our post-secondary folks only, they could be subject to the new procurement rules starting July 1, 2016. Okay. Generally speaking, the standards include requirements on competition. There's a prohibition against geographical preferences. There's requirements that you don't list brand names in your competitions, right? That's restrictive of competition. If you have a particular brand that you want to use, then you say that brand or equivalent. That's all you have to do. Add or equivalent and you're covered. And then the methods of procurement. There are 5 methods of procurement, and COFAR released the Procurement Bear Claw. I did not make this up, right? They came out with the Procurement Bear Claw to demonstrate our new procurement rules. I think it's kind of hilarious. I'm glad to hear some other people share my sense of humor. Okay, so 5 different ways to procure goods, and it really depends on your price threshold. I will tell you, every single school district, every single state, every single college I have ever worked with has more restrictive requirements than the federal requirements. And you always must follow your more restrictive requirements. As I mentioned, there's a lot of layers on all the rules and requirements you have to follow, and that includes your local procurement rules. That includes the state procurement requirements, right? So when the federal government talks about a small purchase, they deem that anything under $150,000. I don't know about you, but that's not exactly a small purchase, right? If you have a purchase under $150,000, the federal requirements are simply that you obtain rate quotations. You do not have to do a cost price analysis. When it says rate quotations, the question was posed to COFAR, well, how many does that mean? And he said, they responded, well, it's plural, so at least 2, right? So you just have to go out and get 2 quotes for any purchase up to $150,000. Not so difficult, right? I am certain that you have more restrictive requirements within your district, within your institution. Micro purchases are new. 3,000 and less, I mentioned this before in the definition section, 3,000 and less, no quotations. The only qualifier on micro purchases is that you distribute them among vendors, right? So that just means you don't always go to